Hi everyone, it's Ryno, and I am done reading Over the Top, A Raw Journey to Self-Love by Jonathan Van Ness. And I want to do a video and tell you my thoughts and feelings about it, kind of point out some of the more interesting things I thought while I read it. Now, this video might be a little bit longer than the ones I'll normally make about book club. There was just a lot of stuff that I felt like was resonating with what Jonathan was saying with my own personal life. So I am going to talk about that a little bit and kind of relate the two. So it'll be a lot about I'll go through, point out some of my favorite parts, but then also tell you kind of why they were my favorites because of how they related to my personal life, and if that makes sense. I mean, I've now said it twice, so I hope it does. But overall, I'll start off by just saying I did enjoy the book. I don't necessarily feel like Jonathan is a writer by nature. However, I thought there was a lot of really interesting insight. There was a lot of very enlightening and even thought-provoking parts of this book. So I thought it was good, and I would be kind of surprised if he didn't end up writing another book in the future, to be 100% honest with you. He's got a lot to say, and if you've ever listened to his podcast, you know that for sure. So I have a ton of notes I wrote on a legal pad, and I know, old-fashioned, right? Pen and paper and everything. And then I also typed those up so I had them fresh in my mind, but I am going to be reading from my computer screen every now and then, so pardon me. And I know I'm never looking directly at the camera because I'm looking at the viewfinder, so it's a whole thing. But I will be looking down at the computer, and so I don't mean to be rude. But I often found this book to be kind of a digestion and a reflection that he kind of put forward on the events of his life. So even though some of the pictures he was painting weren't maybe like crystal clear, it's very clear the things he's learned from those moments in life. So I thought that was really interesting. First and foremost, I enjoy the reboot of Queer Eye from Netflix. If you haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend it. Specifically, the episode, which I believe is the 4th episode in the first season, called "Too Gay or Not Too Gay." Oh my gosh, it will move you to tears, like ugly crying. But I think all the gentlemen on that show, at least from my perception as an audience member, seem cool. I enjoyed them all. And Jonathan has always stood out to me as being somebody who isn't afraid to be his authentic self. I know a lot of times people were like, oh, that guy's over the top. But I think that's kind of how he lives. He lives loud. He lives proud, and I've always liked and respected that about him. And I thought the book was kind of a reflection on how he came to be, at least how the one facet that we see of him on Queer Eye came to be. But the book is a lot about how that is not just him, that's just a piece of him. And there's many pieces of him. It's many different, hence why I enjoyed this cover. It's like all the different personality, and how it makes one thing. So, I wrote down this kind of a metaphor or analogy. I wrote, if the Jonathan we see on Queer Eye is the deepest of breaths that you hold in, then this book for me felt like the big exhale. It was kind of the other side of that personality, the other side of that person, I guess the big deep breath in makes me think like you go, and then the exhale is kind of like what comes after when you have to exhale. What's that how do all the pieces fall? So a lot of what I got from this book was kind of the emphasis on how important communication and safe spaces to communicate can be, and not just for adults, but for people of all ages. If you have seen the Tom Hanks Mr. Rogers movie, which is Won't You Be My Neighbor? And then there's a documentary, and I think That's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. I get them mixed up, but they're both really fascinating because they're kind of about what Mr. Rogers was actually about. And Mr. Rogers was about that children have emotions that are valid emotions, and finding out why they feel certain ways and why they act certain ways, and was also educating about ways that they're going to feel in life at times, and how things can be scary or stuff like that. And I think about I don't know why that kind of relates this to me, but it's kind of, he is really emphasizing a lot of that safe space, and I feel like that's that groundwork that I didn't even realize I was getting from Mr. Rogers. And and I worry sometimes we're in a space where we're coming a long way, but maybe we've kind of lost that part of ourselves, where we respect kids, and not just kids. I don't mean to make this all about kids, but I think it starts when you're a kid, and just always, he really kind of nails that home. It's crazy how many few years we are children, but how deep the impact of the events that happen in those years go on to reflect so many years later. And I think kind of because it happens in a blur for an adult, but it's a lifetime for a child, that we forget that. So there's a lot of interesting correlation to those sort of thoughts for me. At least that's what I was thinking, but I could be crazy. I was just saying, so again, like I said, important communication, safe spaces to communicate, and not just for adults. I said, imagine how much more comfortable in your body you'd feel if you always had a place where you felt safe to speak your mind and your truth, no matter what. Imagine growing up in a way that you could achieve. Imagine growing up that way and what you could achieve, and the happiness and kindness that you could spread to others. It's infectious, and I'm sure we'd all rather happiness be the infectious thing going around right now. So like to keep that train going. But before I get much farther, I said I've got my book with me. As you see, I keep gripping onto it, and I just want to go through and point out some of the more interesting things. Like I said, I'm going to go tell you page numbers. I'm going to read from the book a little bit too. So we're just going to get into that. And again, first of all, I said so little asterisks before we get started. I never really, even before I read this book, I didn't really think I was very similar to Jonathan Van Ness, just in general. Sometimes you see somebody and like, oh my gosh, that's like me. And, it was one of those things where I was just like, oh, I like this guy, but we're nothing, we're like nothing alike. But what was crazy is a lot of the kind of mental and emotional stuff he hits on in this really was so relatable. Not to mention the fact that basically I had to look up how old he was, because every one of his references in this book, I mean, minus I don't know a ton about the gymnastics and the Olympic stuff. I know a little bit about the gymnastics because one of my really good friends growing up, who if had both his ACLs not exploded in a disgusting video, that you can hear it happening. Had it not happened, I think he would have qualified for Olympics at some point. So he was really into the gymnastics. So it's like this weird, Jonathan has these references that really hit for me and my friend, and this like friendship we had growing up. We're still friends today. So I text him while I'm reading this, and I'm like, I think you should read this, because he really likes a good autobiography. But let me see. Yeah, like I said, I've been a fan of the show, but other than that, I don't really know much about Jonathan. As I read more and more, there's a lot of moments and thoughts he has that rang true for me in my life, or kind of with my personality, or even in terms of what I do for work. Being like a presence on the internet or social media or things like that, and kind of the emotional baggage that goes with that some people might not understand. But also I understand that everyone's brain is different, everyone functions different, everyone's emotions are different. It's just about finding a way that says you're valid. And for me, I'm going to use this video a little bit to explain how I feel the way I feel, not as like a feel bad for me or anything like that, just to get it out, to kind of explain the process of how my brain goes through. But so I might have some asides here and there. So so I apologize for how long, for how much I'm going to do the relate to some of those stories or ideology and link it to my own life. But it's just my journey through the book, and I want to share that with you. So, so let me see. Okay. Here we go. So starting on chapter 1, I really kind of feel like this chapter was the mission statement for the book, almost more, or that's what I thought while I was reading it initially. It's all about the different parts of a personality coming together, to create a centered and whole self. About how it starts off on page 5, or it doesn't start on page 5, but the first thing I have for you is on page 5, and I thought this, he spoke about the selective permeability. I thought this was really interesting, so I want to I want to read this, how he learned about this in therapy. So, selective permeability is a term that pertains to cellular membranes letting some but not all molecules enter the cell. The same can apply to interacting with people, not taking on the experiences or negativity of others, but staying open to accepting joy or gratitude. But although I had practiced that behind the chair at work as a hairstylist, I had never had to exercise those muscles so nimbly anywhere, anytime with strangers so often. So learning to hold a safe space for people to share with me while maintaining my well-being is a delicate dance. And that is, people bring up the word empath a lot. I do get, like, people's emotions very much affect me. Like, I can feel, I always say I'm like an emotional sponge and I can feel it. And so, like, I get what he is saying. I am always so touched by double checking your recording, by the stories that people share with me, by the fact that people take their time to even watch this, listen to me at any moment in time, and I always want to make sure that I find the time to repay that. If ever we meet in person, I want to listen to you, talk to you, and and let you know in person, eye to eye, and not just me talking to this glass in front of me, but just to tell you that you matter to me. So, but this is interesting because I definitely suffer from letting too much in. So, let me see here. What did I say? Okay, so then on the top of the next page, on page 6, he goes on to say, "Oh, this one's a little tough." Would you still be so excited to meet me if you really knew who I was, if you knew all things I'd done, if you could see all of my parts? Well, right there, that's kind of something I've struggled with, because I feel like when people get to know you and it's about like a specific topic, or you do a specific thing. So I guess for Jonathan on Queer Eye, it would be, he's the hairstylist and he's this, perceived to be the bubbly, upbeat, over the top one. And when he's not what people expect him to be, in the moments that, like, he's not that person 100% of the time. So when he's not that person, when they meet him and they feel let down, you feel bad about it. But it is also that same thing where it's like when you're in that public center, and this is really true just for anyone, not just like actors or YouTubers or anything. You have this weird kind of one-sided relationship with people. I had someone come up to me once and say, "You're my friend, but I know I'm not yours." And I think about that a lot, because she explained it to me, where she's like, you're in my house. I welcome you into my house. I listen to you at dinner. We are on car rides together, and I talk back. But I know you don't hear me. And she was very aware of that wall between us. But I told her, I was like, this is incredibly insightful, and I never really thought about that before. So you have like kind of expectations of a friend, and it just it struck me, and it means the world to me that any of you would ever watch or listen to me, and I thank you for your time and for you allowing me into your life. I don't take that invitation lightly. And the other side of that, though, is that people kind of perceive you to be the person they want you to be. It can be emotionally exhausting sometimes, but I wouldn't have it another way, I guess. I mean, I guess I'm just saying it because maybe I hope people are aware. And I'd say for the most part, I've never had a bad experience personally. But, I'll always stop and say hello and chat, and we should always take a picture together. That's what I always say. But that's just my personal perspective on it. But anyway, I'm already going to stop and apologize once again for how much I'm going to relate to these stories. So this is my ongoing journey to self-love as well. So I actually thought this book ended up being very appropriate. So on page 9, he says, I thought this was a great quote. He says, comparing ourselves to people on social media is as risky as using WebMD to diagnose yourself. This should be a refrigerator magnet. Am I right? That's that dangerous line we walk, where you think Instagram is this perfect curated life, or people show you exactly what they want to see in any aspects. It's a photo, it's staged. But I also think it can be therapeutic in a way, because you can kind of vicariously live through it. If you're ever looking for a movie that kind of dives into that a little bit, Ingrid Goes West. It was on Hulu. I don't know if it still is. Aubrey Plaza. It's a good movie. But I also thought on page 10 there's an interesting quote. You can be fiercely loving without also being passionate, and sometimes you can't be fiercely loving without also being passionate, and sometimes passionate isn't pretty. Just something to think about. Something to think about. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, this was the point where I had to look up to see how old he was, because a lot of these these references he started making, I was like, oh my gosh, was this my living room? But it's funny, yeah, he's 2 years younger than me. But on page, let me see, 17, he talks about gymnastics being called power tumbling because it's less gay. And like I said earlier, one of my best friends was a really amazing gymnast, and still teaches gymnastics to this day at a gym, and his team does pretty well. But I thought to myself, like, at what point did society deem gymnastics to be gay? Because it's a very it's an Olympic sport, but also it's like it takes a very masculine looking body to do it, for men at least, in terms of a man doing gymnastics. I mean, but then also, have you guys seen Footloose? And I think about like how Ren McCormick, Kevin Bacon, is supposed to be the epitome of cool and that, and he's a gymnast, and there are other male gymnasts in that movie. So it's just a weird thing when did we collectively decide it was going to be bad? It's like when men stole beer from women. And yeah, that's a thing. Look that up. That's really been fascinating me lately too. But again, I digress. So page 25, I'm going to read you a little thing here from page 25, where Jonathan talks about his 2 cousins and how they would play beauty pageants. So let me find the spot here. He says, I loved everything about beauty pageants. I guess I've always felt genderqueer, either both of the genders or somewhere in the middle. I just never knew that it had a name that I could identify with. I was really quick to put on heels and a gorgeous puffy-shouldered evening gown that really terrified my father. I'm sorry, that's a separate sentence. That really terrified my father. I remember him walking in and me being torn out of this puffy black gown, and then there was a new rule that I wasn't allowed to play dress-up with my cousins, but my aunt Ludmila, he changed all the names to Russian names, so it wasn't really about that. So we'd sneakily play with whatever we wanted, though it sometimes took an hour and a half to get out of it and hide the glitter before I went back home to my dad's house. Here's what I imagine was going through my dad's brain. A boy playing with makeup? Impossible. A boy wants to carry a purse? Not my son. Find a boy playing dress up in an evening gown? Tear it off his body. A boy playing with Barbies? Panic. This cannot be my son's life. I will shake, scare, and rattle it out of him. This has to be a phase. I knew that my dad loved me, but he was a young father doing his best to come to terms with what was for him a scary reality. The really sad part about this too, the next sentence really kind of breaks my heart, which is, I didn't need gigantic divine secrets of the sisterhood moments to know that there was something wrong with me. And that breaks my heart. First of all, I'll never understand this thing. We could do a whole nother video about masculinity and the perception of masculinity, which he does talk about in this book at some times, and what masculinity actually is versus what toxic masculinity actually is. And I wish there was a lot more education about that. I'm sure the youth of America is getting educated, getting in touch with that more, and hopefully continually more. But how does a kid wearing a dress affect you? Like, I never understand that. I have somebody in my life who lets his son wear his dresses all the time, and he seems the happiest kid in the world when he wears it. And I think it's one of those things, like, it touches me, and I should communicate with him and say what it means. I think that it's an amazing thing, to just let that kid live. What makes him happy makes him happy. Maybe it is a phase and he'll grow out of it. Maybe he won't, and that's what he likes. And maybe he'll be the best fashion designer. And maybe he'll work at Trader Joe's and help serve people during a pandemic. You don't, like, what does it matter to your life? I never understood that. I don't know what this thing is. He does kind of go into this a little bit later, which I find interesting, because I was going to say, I feel like this is especially true in older generations, but he does come around and talk about, obviously he's not a parent and doesn't know how to parent, but he talks about how and when we grew up, it was about filling in a role, like you learn to read, you learn to ride a bike, you play a sport, you do these things, but not about like self about how to take care of yourself. And that's something I always find interesting. One of my favorite things about him is how he talks about being beautiful from the inside out, and how skincare and beauty products and stuff like that can help you feel confident. So, uh, anyway, also, this is at the point in the book he talks about food all the time, and I'm like starving while I read this. I don't know if I was the only one, but I also started to write a note about how this is the chapter where he started to remind me about where I was like, oh, he reminds me of me, only instead of ice skating for me, it was Power Rangers. And then literally 3 sentences later, he mentions Power Rangers. And I'm like, and it's not the only time. He brings it up a couple times in the book. So I was like, oh, we are similar. We probably would have been friends when we were kids. He probably would have hated me, though. So chapter 3, the loyalty. So in this, Jonathan talks a lot about, this is another one of those things that kind of related to, he talks a lot about how his mother, so his parents divorced, and he talks about how he wasn't really sad about it. My parents I grew up divorced, and it never bothered me. I love my dad, I love my mom, and like, they got in fights and whatever, and I was like Jonathan, where I was always dragging my feet going over my dad's house, and it's just because, he was a young dad, didn't relate to the kids very well, but the same way that Jonathan talks about, and it's funny, like, so my mom worked a lot, and I'd go to work with my grandparents, who my grandfather was the operating manager of Edaville Railroad, which is this like kind of like railroad themed theme park in Massachusetts, and so I grew up like on the railroad tracks, which was amazing to me. But Jonathan talks about how his mother worked a lot, and she spent a lot of time with their family's newspaper. It was one of those things where I was like, I get it. I get what he was, that thing where you're running around in this adult world sometimes. But so let me see here. I got another little bit I want to read to you. I think it was on page 44. He says, my mom accepted me completely when so many others couldn't. And I just thought, what a wonderful human being his mother, at least how he's painting her, must be. I was very lucky that my mother was just kind of like, she don't care about any of that stuff. As long as you're not hurting anybody, that's what matters most. You treat people with respect and stuff. And so I think it's important that as an adult, Jonathan kind of reflects on how his mother gave him that space, and if it wasn't for her, who knows how his life kind of would have went. But he was lucky to at least have one person like his mother in his life, and I think how sad it is that some people have nobody like that in their life when they go through something like he goes through. Also, Jonathan talks about Quincy being a smaller town, which is 36,000 people. I thought my town wasn't too small, but apparently it was, because I grew up with only 12,000 people, which is insane to me. So he talks about his stepfather, Steve, and like right away when he starts writing about him, you can tell in the writing that he cares a great deal for Steve, even though he says how he resisted him and his mother's happiness and stuff in the beginning. But there's just something I thought was really beautiful about he says a line, Steve believed that other people's opinions are not a reflection of you as long as your spirit is thriving. And I think that's such a beautiful lesson that he could have learned from his stepfather. That's amazing. So we are moving on to chapter 4. It is round off, back handspring full. And again, I have to say, because Jonathan and I are so close in age, a lot of these references, this is where I started to really realize it really rang through for me. So chapter 4 had me thinking about how mean kids can be, because this is where he kind of talks about he finally wanted to do it and join gymnastics and do all these things, and like the kids kind of bullied him about his weight, or why he wasn't very upper body strong, about why he couldn't do some stuff. And I just think, like, why are we mean when we're children? Or I don't know. I'm not saying everybody was mean. I tried not to be a mean child. I mean, I wasn't. I was definitely the person who, when somebody was being mean to, I would go to the person they were being mean to and talk to them. But there's a big thing about like fat shaming in this, and I do not understand that. I was a heavy kid when I was younger. I've always struggled with my weight, but I always think it's one of the things like I really hate about myself, but it's just ingrained because we're so mean when we're kids. Like, even as adult, the first insult we go to is always about somebody's weight, and I'll never understand that. what does it matter? It has no reflection on you. And I always think, like, so Jonathan talks about he went to gymnastics as an escape to do what he loved and make some new friends, and he ended up quitting. And it was kind of the unwelcomeness of the kids. It was just their general, like, I've had similar experiences in my life like this, and it really, like, we would go to Sunday school once, and I remember the kids weren't necessarily mean, but they didn't really, like, talk to me. It just didn't fit in. There was no, like, welcoming thing, and I thought, well, if they're not welcoming here, they're not going to be welcoming in very many places. And so I don't know. I've gotten better in later years now by just saying, F it. You got to go do. If it's something you want to do, it's going to feel uncomfortable. But what could potentially come out on the other side of that experience is going to make up for that uncomfortable feeling. I promise you. So it's not always going to work, but sometimes just talk yourself into it if you can. But on page 72, he makes an amazing reference to, in regards to a sad thing in his life, but he makes an amazing reference to Amy Jo Johnson's made-for-TV movie, The Perfect Body, which had me screaming because I honestly make references to that a lot in my everyday life, and nobody knows what I'm talking about. So I can't believe that he made a reference to The Perfect Body, which I owned and watched way too many times because Power Rangers, and we're obsessed with Amy Jo Johnson. So on page 26, he talks about the identified patient. Now, this is something else that I thought was really fascinating about how he kind of was becoming the identified patient, which is a person in a dysfunctional system who becomes the problem person by acting out the pain of a dysfunctional system. And what a terrible cycle that sounds like to break out of. That sounds like once you're in there, a lot of people get trapped and stay in there. And it's just something... I think it's something for everyone involved in that system to kind of think about. I've had a sister that when I read this, I was immediately like, I think my sister might suffer from this. Like, and so I'm gonna be like, read this book, but just something to consider, So a lot of like mental wellness, that's, even though it's maybe not, he does specifically talk about taking care of yourself and things, but I feel like you can really tell there's an emphasis on emotional wellness, mental wellness, physical wellness in this. So chapter 5, Love Starved. Jonathan talks about something that so Jonathan talks about something that plagued my younger years. There was an autocorrect problem, so I didn't understand what I was writing severely. And honestly, it still kind of does to this day, but I've gotten much better about it. But this is in reference to his swim fan, not really boyfriend, Fyodor? I don't know. So it's on page 98. And he says, "This is what the inside of my brain looked like. When do I get to see you again? When's our next date? What's our next plan? What's our next mall trip? What's our next swim meet? If there wasn't a next, I was not okay, and I would be calling him trying to figure out how to manifest one." That insecurity level was like, boom, that hit me. That's how I was like in high school. And again, it's still how I am today. I honestly feel like a lot of the relationships I established, and maybe this is just on me and the type of people involved in my life, I need a certain type of validation. And when I feel confident in that friendship, like I know we're friends, but sometimes I think people are just friends with me because it's convenient for them in their life right now. And I don't want that. I want to be friend. Like I am the type of person who's going to do anything for you, it's a bad habit sometimes. It's a good type of friend, but it is, I guess, I don't know. I just always feel that insecurity. Oh my gosh, in high school, it was like, if we did not know the next time we were doing something, that's also how I feel when you meet somebody new and you're vaguely like tiptoeing, being like, okay, we'll have to do this again, like next Saturday, like 5 p.m. No, okay, bye. We've all been there. Come on. If not, my gosh, your life. It's just insecurity. I always feel forced on people, and a lot of the time that's on me. Like I said, I have validation issues. I think about something that Jonathan said on page 100. It was after his friend told the whole school that he and Fyodor, whatever, were dating, and their friendship immediately ceased. He said, "In one day, my life as I'd known it changed." And that is crazy commonplace for many LGBTQ youths and adults. How often life just hits this paradigm shift. Like, I think what's great about this book, and it would be great if there was a lot more allies and people like that could read this, parents with LGBTQ plus youth or something, because think about what high school was like just for like, think about what it is when you think back on a stereotypical high school reunion. And, it's puberty. You got emotions running wild, hormones going crazy, your brain chemistry is all insane. On top of that, you're learning a lot about yourself. On top of that, now you're somebody that's learning, there's a lot of hate and shame out in the world there for you discovering that you're this part about you that's just about you. It's just, you're in your DNA. You're born this way, as Lady Gaga would say. And so it's just imagine like the already weight that it was like when you were 15 or 16, and then add this extra other part of your life that you have to carry on top of you. I recommend watching Love, Simon as well. That's a really good movie, but good tool for anybody, any parents out there too. I feel like the parents react in a very healthy way to their kids, and everybody should watch that movie. I love that movie. But it just, the youth, it takes so much longer for you to find you. Like, finding you is always a journey in life, but it starts so much later because people unfortunately have to always kind of pretend to be somebody they're not. And that's, luckily I had a super healthy way of internalizing this, where I felt like I had a secret identity. So that's how I had it. I had it like I was a Power Ranger walking through these halls, not afraid that they'd find out, but knowing if they did, I could lose my power. So that was the fantasy I definitely latched onto. I'm realizing it now, later. I mean, I think I was definitely aware of it then too, but I'm lucky I lived with the imagination I had, and just something to think about. Not everybody's got that imagination. So that brings us to chapter 6, Eggplant Emoji. Now on page 106, I believe there's something I'm going to read here in a second. He hits on some real truth, and my goodness, this is he was messaging with that kid online, or not kid, he is a kid, they're both kids, I don't mean to make it creepy, but he talks about, oh wait, is this that part? Yeah, okay, I wanted to read this. It's because I have this, like, I have this really terrible, I have a lot of real issues I need to speak to somebody about, but he talks about how the kid, he says, in one he sent me, he was dressed as Willy Wonka in a Halloween costume. It was my first experience with what I've come to recognize as a disease you can acquire from any man you're into. He shares something with you that causes such a knee-jerk reaction that it turns you off him forever, and you can never quite shake it. That Willy Wonka thing was the beginning of that disease. Boy, oh boy, did I suffer from this. And I still kind of like, sometimes when people like me too much, it starts to make me be like, ugh. But I don't know. It's only sometimes. It's a weird turn, I feel, and just kind of self-hatred. It's fine. It's healthy. I'm healthy. We're all healthy, right? What did I say here? There it says oh, okay. So this is the part about the parents I was talking about earlier. I'm sorry for that pause there. So I'm gonna read basically about a page and a half here, because this is the parenting thing. So it's, in doing a lot of work I've done to heal the wounds inflicted on me in Quincy, I can see how in that era there was so much emphasis, both external and internal, on being who I needed to be for my parents, which happened to be the glaring opposite of everything I needed to be. My mom still accepted me completely and loved me all the way, yet in the way that sometimes love just isn't enough, she couldn't teach me how to fully love and nurture and accept myself. This may come as a shock, but I don't have a doctorate in parenting. I don't know what it's like to raise a child, but I know that when I was growing up, the emphasis was on fitting into the mold that was expected of you while under your parents' roof. You respect the rules and you don't talk back. Once you're 18, you can do what you want, but if your parents pay the bills, they run the house. The emphasis is less on raising someone who can take care of themselves and more on following the ideas that have been passed down to you. And then suddenly you're 18 and you become a baby adult who's so angry and doesn't know how to self-soothe. You only know how to soothe your parents' nervous system. What I needed to learn was how, through a really painful experience of being bullied, how to deal with what I needed to learn was how to get through a really painful experience of being bullied, how to deal with embarrassment, how to deal with feeling gross about myself, how to deal with extreme discontentment with my body image. But those weren't things that we talked about in our house. It was about following the rules, not about knowing how to move through life in a way where you could ask the question, what's the next best decision for me? I needed to learn how to become a more curious, well-rounded, independent person, the kind of queen who could work with other people but still be a ferocious bitch. Instead, I'd spent my life up until that point trying and failing to fit into the roles that didn't fit me at all. Gosh, and he talks a lot about that sort of rejection he gets from trying to fit into those roles, but I can understand what he's saying. It's not like and he even says it, it's not like the parents are doing a bad job or anything like that, but it was just something we didn't talk about. I don't know. It was interesting. Just something to reflect on. But this is the chapter where it gets toward the end of this chapter. It starts to take that kind of scary, sad turn of events. It's the beginning of the escort stuff. So let's move on to chapter 7, The Gutsy Queen. And one thing that Jonathan said that struck me in this chapter on page 133. Let's open our books to page 133, please. He says, my career as a hairdresser was unfolding gorgeously, but being a part of a group like in swim team or cheerleading gave me a social circle and something I looked forward to. Now in Phoenix, for the first time in a long time, I didn't have an activity to keep me busy outside of work and had me feeling wayward. It's interesting. This I don't know why this one line made me kind of reflect on that, like that process of going from like high school to college, where I was in all these after school activities, and then all of a sudden in college it was like nothing. I was cut off. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know what I was doing, and I tried to get into stuff, but it wasn't like people were cold, but it was like it wasn't also welcoming because everybody's going through their own things too. And I just kind of think about how it was my high school English teacher who was basically my mentor, and who offered, he said, well, if you're back in town, come and help build the sets for the play. And so I got into that, and he gave me something to latch onto that I had a very difficult time, that gave me a purpose and a meaning. And then, the kind of the same thing, and it really, we're still friends today, and I really should tell him how much, I reflecting on that now, what that meant in my life to me, and how such a simple thing you can do for somebody can ripple through and mean so much for them. But it was the same thing when I moved to Florida. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have the job yet. And I knew one person. It was my roommate who's like, oh, we got an extra room. Do you want to move down? I thought, whatever, the rent's cheap. I'll give it a try. And basically within 3 weeks of moving here, he moved out and moved in with somebody he had just met. And I was alone. And I was like lost. And, eventually I found myself. But those times can be they can be tough for people. Also, let's talk about the salon that Jonathan worked at. It sounds like a nightmare, like a super toxic work environment. I seem to have a bad habit of allowing myself to get involved in toxic environments sometimes in life, but guys, you really cannot. Think about this. You spend more time at work than you do with your friends, and a lot of times more than you do with your family, so you should always be comfortable there and try and be comfortable in what you do. You don't have to love what you do, but at least like it. If you hate it, then really do something that makes you happy. I know that's easier said than done, especially now in this time, but it's just something to kind of ponder on. That in the end, if you add up all the hours of your life, you've spent a lot of hours at work. I know it's one of the essentials of life, but it's a family too. It's another type of a family. So make it the family you want to make it. Not like the place in Jonathan's book. So we're moving on to chapter 8. That's about Mr. Clean. This is when he meets Sergey, I believe. And Sergey sounded like a really cool guy. It really bums me out, the series of events they went through together. But I think he makes kind of a really poignant observation at this one point that he doesn't necessarily super expand on, but he says on... I'm sorry. This is not the observation I was thinking of, but he said, but it's another really good observation. I'm going to read it to you here. He said, On 158, he said he wasn't afraid to hold my hand. We took cute pictures positioned like we were at prom, like him standing behind me. There was no piece of him that felt ashamed about those moments of public affection, and that meant something to me. He was the first person I didn't see as being remotely ashamed of me. One of my early boyfriends once put his arm around me leaving school, and the instant shame caused me to recoil. So often for gay people, sex and attraction is kept behind closed doors. Of the numerous people I've been with sexually, there were maybe 2 total I would have felt good about being seen with. Sergey was the ideal image of a partner, the manifestation of every dream I'd ever had, I ever knew. I read too far into that one, but yeah, the thing he says, so often for gay people, sex and attraction is kept behind closed doors, is he talks about shame in the book a lot, and you think about like, and I think it's I think it was Mr. Rogers too, and that's why I brought it up earlier, who does also address shame and saying like, you basically, you shouldn't, if it's something we do as a human, you shouldn't be embarrassed about it, because then it makes you feel shamed about it, and you shouldn't feel shame about something that's being human. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but it's interesting how shameful we all make ourselves feel, like individually, and how we push that onto other people. But it's just really something to think about. Gosh, there's a lot of things to think about in this book. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to preach or anything here, but these are just what I got from the book. So I got a little bit more left, not a ton, but bear with me here. The original point I thought I was reading was on page 59. He says, I was so busy trying to be what I thought he wanted. And I think it's important to kind of read this whole part here again too. So he says, I was so busy trying to be what I thought he wanted, which for some reason I was sure was nothing more than a really tight butt. We had a fundamental disconnect in how we communicated our needs, especially in terms of how we communicated in bed. The way we connected sexually didn't match the level of intensity I had experienced through so many years of casual, app-driven, or under the influence sexual behavior. After all, I'd been a very busy girl. I was unable to tell him what I wanted and needed, which was a great level of intimacy. But we had differences in how we did our gorgeous horizontal tango, falling in love in what felt like my first real adult relationship, and not having him seem to want to passionately throw me around the way I thought he would hurt. And being young, gay, and new to how gorgeous butts work during sexy time put strain on our relationship, because I didn't feel that fire from Sergey. It set me up to feel rejected. Oh my gosh, yeah. This book is really, I said for me, the biggest takeaway I take from this is about setting up safe spaces of communication and safe spaces to be yourself. And I think this is an important one in relationship and in life, that nobody should ever feel ashamed about anything, embarrassed about what they're doing, but should also keep that healthy line of communication open, especially because you're going to start feeling this, like he talks about, that you're setting yourself up for to feel rejected, or it sets you up to feel rejected. And it's, I've been through that part of my life where it felt like that was all that I was worth, was that part. And then you get in a relationship where somebody doesn't want to do any of that stuff, and you're like, well, this is terrible. What do I have to offer now? And then it's a whole spiral. It's a whole thing. I'm not going to go into that too much, because in case my mom watches it, I am not ready to write my Jonathan book yet. But and it would not nearly be as dark as this either. I will say that. I am happy to see where he pulled himself out of, is it, and I'm happy that he shared his journey. So I'm gonna say too. So this is kind of starting to get into where Steve's getting sick, and it's sad. It's really sad. It's sad when anybody goes. It's sad when you hear a story about it being such a person so important in someone's life too. And I wrote down this line because it is just so true. Cancer will always be a thief, a greedy bitch who steals the dignity from people closest to you. And yeah, it is terrible. So then at the end of this chapter, he kind of closes in, he puts in his, the Bill Clinton sex scandal report he did when he was a kid. And, it's a funny read, because it's also like, it reminded me of being that age and being like, I have to use all these types of words in here. But also, like, when you're trying to communicate what something means to you, but you're interpreting it certain ways. And I just always think, like, I wrote like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how upset he was about this one thing. How his head must be exploding in the year 2020, as you know if you follow him on any social media. But I thought it was a nice perspective thing to put in there. So chapter 9, Jonathan and the No Good, Very Bad Summer. One of my favorite lines during this book, even though it happens during the saddest part of this book, is on page 192 when Jonathan says, "Our grief was all leading us toward Mexican food." I laughed out loud at this, and then 2 seconds later I'm crying, but I laughed out loud because I want this on, like, I want like a photo of like a beautiful Mexican spread, and then just to have that over like written over it, "Our grief was all leading us toward Mexican food," and I want that in my kitchen. I love Mexican food so much, so I think this was hilarious. But then the Steve passing away is so sad. The family member in hospital. At least everybody was able to be here with them. I thought that was nice. But oh my gosh, the part about the dog Abby, where he said who waited by the door for 3 days for Steve to come back. I'm reading that while my dog is asleep in my lap, and I am like bawling my eyes out and had to close the book and just like hug my dog for a little while because, my God, I love those little babies more than anything I have probably ever loved or will ever love again in my entire life. So we don't deserve animals. We really don't. So around like page 196 in this chapter through 197, I started kind of wondering if we were ever going to hear from Sergey again, which we do a little bit. He talks about it, but I started wondering what it must be like for Sergey when Jonathan has his rise to fame on Queer Eye, after Sergey being so close to all of this. Like, for Jonathan, what was the basement on his elevator, the rock kind of bottom, and I hope they made up, or not made up. I'm sure, I hope he reconciled. I know that's part of 12-step programs too, is at least reaching out to people that you may have wronged or something. And I hope, I hope there was some, maybe, like, I don't want to say restitution, but I don't know. I hope that, obviously, clearly Sergey was acknowledged because there's much written about him in the book here, and he knows who he is. So, okay, so I also thought it might be important because there was some interesting stuff that Jonathan had in here after we learned about him contracting HIV. Which was a sad part of this journey, which I knew before I read this book because the day the book was published, they like revealed it everywhere, and I was like, well, that doesn't happen till so later in the book. You spoiled it. He clearly took the information he was given and became very knowledgeable about his subject matter. And I do respect that about him also. Making like putting that in this book and getting involved with it, and like he goes off on these little tangents too every now and then with these little sub information things, which I found really interesting. But he's a smart guy. Like I said, his podcast, Getting Curious, I think it's Getting Curious, with Jonathan Van Ness, I've listened to a couple episodes, is interesting. So I am going to read about this one part here about HIV. And okay, so he says, "I think it's super important to note here, within just 2 weeks of being on medication, HIV was undetectable in my blood. People who achieve and maintain an undetectable viral load have effectively no risk of sexually transmitting the virus to an HIV-negative partner. Undetectable is a term that applies to many people living with HIV. An undetectable HIV viral load means there are so few copies of that virus in your blood that the test cannot detect them. Even the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, agrees that a person with an undetectable viral load effectually poses no risk of transmitting the HIV virus through unprotected sex. An HIV-positive mother with an undetectable viral load can even deliver her baby with less than 1% risk of transmission, as long as the mother takes HIV medicine daily throughout pregnancy and the baby takes it for 4 to 6 weeks after birth. The mother, he says the mother thing doesn't totally pertain to me. I just think it's incredible how far we've come in the HIV/AIDS treatment. He says, knowing all of that and communicating it is difficult. Sometimes it feels like I'm convincing people that I'm okay or clean or safe. It's always best to do your own research. All the facts are out there, which I do agree with him. It's definitely best to do all the research that you can about anything like this or anything like that. But it's the viral load thing is interesting information, and I don't think it's often shared as much as it should be, So I am going to read a little bit more about this because I also found this kind of fascinating. There's so much work that has to be done around this conversation. This is page 206. And that's part of why I'm telling you this now, as hard as it is. In a lot of this country, you can be treated as a felon for living with HIV. Someone can have their whole world turned upside down because of archaic laws that are written to criminalize and demonize people with HIV, whether it's people being harassed or incarcerated or being denied refugee status based on their HIV. There are too many outdated laws and regulations that negatively impact and further stigmatize people living with HIV. We need to see policy that reflects the modern medical understanding of what living with HIV/AIDS is. HIV is a health issue, not a criminal one, and not a moral one. Anyone can get it. Homosexuality and HIV stigmatization is a big problem in the United States and all over the world. In places like Chechnya, the Middle East, parts of Africa, Asia, and even in the US, where homosexuality and HIV/AIDS are so rampantly stigmatized that it can be nearly impossible to get medication, and as information is pervasive, the spread of the disease is on the rise. The CDC and the New York Times have done incredible work on the silent stigma ravaging the American South. HIV doesn't care. It affects everyone. But with what we know, we can stop the suffering HIV is causing. I'm going to keep going just a little bit more. My HIV infection would end up helping me learn to love myself so much more than I ever had before. When I got HIV, I felt that I wasn't allowed to be seen as sexy or desirable. I had to work so much harder to fall in love with and accept where I'd come to in my life and forgive myself for all the decisions I'd made to get there. There wasn't an overnight process. It was a daily one. To a lesser degree, even today, it still is. Life is so much a daily exercise in learning to love yourself, forgive yourself over and over. I think that's some interesting information right there, and I felt like I really wanted to share that out there. So, that we have had this, pandemic that was not really paid attention to or cared for very properly in the 80s, and luckily I was so young. It's one of those things like I don't remember it, but if you do want I think a good movie, a really good movie, is The Normal Heart. It was an HBO movie, and it had like a million stars, and it's like Mark Ruffalo, Julia Roberts is in it, but it's a really fascinating look at how, like, the beginning of the outbreak of HIV and why it affected the gay community more than so many others, and kind of how it was on the tail end of all this other stuff. It's really fascinating, and then you could follow that up with the Dallas Buyers Club, because then that would be about what was going on with the medication in the hospitals and everything like that. But they are sad, so be emotionally strong while you watch them. But phenomenal films, highly recommend them. So chapter 10 here. Almost done, guys. Almost done, I promise. We are on to chapter 10, which is the Khaleesi within, except the whole unfortunate ending. I don't know anything about Game of Thrones, so a lot of that is lost to me. I didn't know that Jonathan was famous from that, but I know that he talks about it a lot in the book here. But I think how amazing that it is that one conversation with just a random stranger could change your life, and how generous that Erin Gibson, this has been maybe like a human to have just kind of overheard that, put her mind into this creative mode, thought, I'm going to take a chance on this guy, this idea. And like, I love that. It's just, he said the right thing in the right place in front of the right person, and who was open to creativity and possibility. And think what happens when you are open to that sort of a thing in life. What things can come from that. It's a domino effect. So I loved the line on page 218. Also, Erin Gibson's book sounds really interesting too. I didn't write the title in here, but you can check it out. Look up her name, Erin Gibson. It's about just look it up. So on 218, he says, being normal is being completely unique because nobody's the same. I feel like I said at one point, I don't like the word different. I like the word unique. But he says, normal, honey? Who is she anyway? I loved that. On 219, I also loved the bit where he talked about the content creation bee, which I was just talking about. And that is, he says, as Game of Thrones continued to pick up momentum, I had been stung by the content creation bee. She's an elusive little creature. Her sting is highly addictive. Her symptoms include a constant need for creative expression, an incessant thirst for validation, and a sense of having something to say but not knowing quite how to say it. And my God, those he put into words basically this like I had a short film I made during school that it was pretty good and it came out well, and I still think it's one of the best things I've made. I did do this short kind of documentary thing for work that I thought was really good too. But it's one of those things where I was just like, I want narrative stuff. I want to film. I want to be a part of a narrative film thing, and I did so many of these things in a row, and then all of a sudden I hit this block, and I was like, I don't know what I want to say anymore. I know I want to say something, but I just don't know how to say it. And like, film is a language we learn, and that's why I went into film. And you know, for anybody that's got communication things, think about that. Film is a language. But I'm getting off topic. Another video, another day. So he says, I also like the bit about people believing in you. That was on page 222. Let me see. He said, when the people around you believe in you and your potential wholeheartedly, you can make your dreams come true. If they believe your dreams are out of reach, you have to open the door and make your way to people who want to basket toss your ass right into those dreams. And at the end of the day, the people we let in our space affect our ability to get to where we want to go. So if they're in the way of realizing your potential, it's okay to disconnect because you must choose yourself. I used to think that was selfish, but really it's just healthy. And sometimes that is really true. Sometimes it can be too much of one, too much of another. But yeah, if somebody ever says to you, you can't do it, boop, bye. So chapter 11, who is she? It's the last little bit here, I promise. This is where he gets into the job or how he got the queer eye stuff. I actually thought the parts about this book didn't feel quite as like, maybe, I don't want to say meaningful. It was interesting because, you know, obviously I think a lot of people read the book because they want to know about that aspect of it, but I think he wanted to tell, it makes it very clear in the beginning that he wants this book to show all the other facets that aren't that. So I feel like he had an obligation to put it in, but he was kind of like, it's not the journey he's ready to necessarily completely reflect on. He does reflect on it a little bit, but I definitely think he knows he's like in the throes of it right now. But I do love what he said about meeting Karamo, which is on the top of, or he talks about meeting Karamo for the first time on page 231. He says, as soon as I saw him, my vagina melted into a puddle all over his cobalt blue suit. And I thought, same, girl, same. That would be the same for me. There's a nice bit where he says, he talks about acceptance. That's at the bottom of page 232. If I've learned anything, it's that acceptance is the key to so much, and we find so much freedom in feeling fierce about what we're accepting. And he does go on to say that one big exception to this philosophy would be if you're dealing with something like gender dysmorphia. There's also so much freedom to be found in owning your truth about what needs to be changed on your outside to reflect your inside. And I do like that he has the exception, you know, to that. But it's an interesting thing there. Acceptance is the key to so much, and we find so much freedom in feeling fierce about what we're accepting. But yeah, so then on page 250, he kind of had a culmination paragraph about some of the issues I relate to him on when it comes to people perceiving you to be like one way or another. So I'm just going to read you that paragraph, and then I think I maybe have like one more little piece to read, and that's kind of it, and I'll wrap up here. He says, one thing that bothers me is when people only want me to be one thing. This effervescent, gregarious, majestic, center part blow dry, cotton candy figure skating queen who wants to give you feedback on your eyebrows and compliment your haircut. I am that queen a lot of the time, but that's not all of me. Sometimes I need to tweet about how we shouldn't be lionizing Ronald Reagan when he has the blood of countless gay men on his hands. That's when people tweet at me, can't you leave politics out of it? What happened to sweet JVN? Those people have probably thrown this book down and burned it at this point, though. I think that's hilarious. But also, that is the fine line when you work in a sector where you're trying to do a thing where when you have a voice, you have a responsibility, I think, to use that voice for I guess it's your choice how you use it, but ethically speaking, I would hope you use it to make the world a better place. And there gets to a time where sometimes I just can't keep it in, and it's how I believe. And I will happily have conversations with anybody, a level-headed conversation where we talk about facts and all that and break stuff down with you. I don't need to be screaming or have anybody yell at me or call me names or anything like that, which I will leave out of this. But so on page 52, I also like the quote, "If you can't take me at my raw, heated moment, you don't deserve me at my composed, Emmy's glam moment." Then there's like kind of a bunch of pages here toward the end where it's a lot about people coming up and asking to take a picture with him and how he doesn't mean to be rude and how he's oftentimes running late, but he talks about it for a long time. So it feels like it's a long-winded explanation of him being like, don't talk to me or come up to me, but he also says he likes it. So that's where he and I differ greatly, because I will never be in that overwhelmed. I mean, I'm always overwhelmed. It's me. Come on. I'm anxiety, ball of anxiety. But even when I've been late or running or whatever, it's like, I mean, I'm not on the level of him. I'm like not even a fraction of that level. I'm talking like little bit, like I'm, yeah. And so like, I don't know. I can get it, I guess, if somebody's being rude, but I don't know. That's the one part where I'm like, oh, I think you're really trying to drive home the point that you are not Jonathan that we see on Netflix, really. And but either way, you know what? He puts out some positive messages here that I think will really help people. It's so the last bit that I thought was a nice sentiment, the very last part here, I was on page 256. I'm going to read it. I'm going to read you just the last part here. What's the part I wanted to start at? I hope sharing my story. Oh my goodness, I can't find it. I was afraid to write in my book. So he says, I hope sharing my story encourages people to be more aware and compassionate on issues that may not directly affect them and spread that compassion to more people who need it. I have come to learn, though, that the more you love and accept yourself, the less you need other people's approval. I never want my childlike spirit, my desire to learn and entertain to change. I'm still the same Jonathan, except nowadays I get to sleep under the tender gaze of all these power queens from my mom's quilt. I love that his mother made him this quilt that he asked for. But and then I thought a nice last touch here was the resources page he added in here, which has stuff like Planned Parenthood, the Phoenix House, kind of anywhere, the Trevor Project. So I thought that was really, really, I thought that was nice touch in the book there. But so like I said, overall, I enjoyed the read. There was a lot of moments for me to kind of meditate on and think about, and things I saw that I related to that I didn't think I was going to relate to. And I thought that was really the big takeaway for me in this. So I really like to hear feedback from you. So I'm going to do one more video about this book, Over the Top. We'll see how it goes. And in that video, I think I'd like to have a dialogue with some people out of the chat room on YouTube or the comment section and just kind of get their feedback and read that out loud so we can see what you thought about Over the Top, A Raw Journey to Self-Love by Jonathan Van Ness. And we can have our discussion for our book club this week. And then I will post another video where I will let you know what our next book club book is going to be. And I've got it narrowed down to 2. I know what it's going to be. I just want to make sure it's accessible enough for in this time that as I'm recording this, it's not super easy to leave our house. So just a reminder too, if you are interested in reading this book or anything, obviously you can still get it on Amazon. I believe there's a Kindle version. You can get an audiobook. A lot of local libraries now have access to online materials too. I know of Hoopla and Libby are 2 resources that you can reach out to. A lot of times you can get your library card online. Fun fact, I have never been into a library in Orlando, but I've had a library card now for, I don't know, like 10 years. And they'll mail me the book. They're not doing that right now, obviously, but you can just like go in and get the ebooks, the audiobooks, stuff like that. They don't have everything, but it's an impressive thing. And, if you're in a small town, it might not be the same thing, but something worth looking into. I don't want anyone to have to spend money to be a part of this really or anything like that. I wouldn't try not to steer you wrong, but thank you everybody for watching this. If you made it this far into the video, I really appreciate it. If you want to subscribe to the channel and be notified whenever I do more book club videos or really just kind of random videos about life, I hope to start doing more different types of things on here. More than just the music videos. I will post more videos of the dogs and everything like that. If you want to get in touch to have a conversation too, you can always get me on Twitter or Instagram. It's Ryno, RYNO1185. That's me on like all social media. So I'd love to hear what you had to think about the book. But like I said, let's get it in the next video where you tell me your thoughts and feelings on Over the Top: A Raw Journey. I cannot ever say the title of this book correctly. A Raw Journey to Self-Love by Jonathan Van Ness. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and I'll see you next time with another book club video. Bye everyone.